The U.S. Pioneer moved smoothly through the endless darkness of space. It was humanity's first deep space diplomatic vessel, built not for war, but for peace. Captain Elias Carter stood on the bridge, his hands behind his back, watching the vast expanse beyond the ship's windows. They had traveled far beyond human space, into the unknown. Today was historic, humanity's first meeting with the Xilari Empire. The Xilari were one of the most advanced alien civilizations in the galaxy. Their ships were sleek and powerful, their technology far beyond what humans had developed. The hope was that they would welcome humanity into the stars as allies. That was why the Pioneer had come, not with weapons, but with open hands. "Captain, we're receiving a transmission," said Lieutenant Sarah Puddle from the communications console. Carter nodded. "Put it through." A holographic image flickered to life in the center of the bridge. A tall, elegant Xilari figure appeared. His skin shimmered like metal, and his golden eyes studied Carter with cold curiosity. "I am High Commander Xelvorin of the Xilari Empire," the alien said, his voice smooth but emotionless. "You are humans. Your presence in our space is unexpected." Carter straightened. "I am Captain Elias Carter of the United Systems. We come in peace, seeking friendship and cooperation between our people." Xelvorin tilted his head slightly. "Friendship, cooperation." He let out a quiet, almost amused sound. "Humans are new, unproven. You speak as if you are equals, yet you arrive in a ship that is barely beyond primitive." Carter remained calm. He had expected hesitation from the Xilari. He had not expected open disrespect. "We understand that you are more advanced than us. We only wish to learn, to grow together." Xelvorin's golden eyes flashed. "You misunderstand, Captain. The Xilari do not form bonds with lesser beings. You have overstepped your place." A silence fell over the bridge. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Carter's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "We are not enemies." The Xilari commander leaned closer to the holographic screen. "You are nothing." Without another word, the transmission cut off. The hologram flickered and vanished, leaving only the hum of the ship's systems in the air. "Captain, that didn't sound like a friendly response," said Patel hesitantly. Carter exhaled slowly. "No, it didn't." Before anyone could say more, alarms blared across the bridge. "Captain," shouted Lieutenant James Monroe from the tactical console. "Multiple Xilari warships just appeared. They weren't on sensors a moment ago." The screen displayed them, sleek, silver vessels, surrounding the Pioneer like hunters circling their prey. "Open a channel again," Carter ordered. Patel worked quickly. "They aren't responding." A deep hum vibrated through the ship. Then, without warning, a bright energy beam struck the Pioneer. The ship shook violently, lights flickering as systems struggled to handle the impact. "Shields are failing," Monroe yelled. "Evasive maneuvers," Carter commanded, gripping his chair. The Pioneer tried to move, but the Xilari ships were too fast. Another blast hit them. Sparks flew from the control panels. The ship groaned under the force of the attack. "Engines are offline. We're losing power." Carter clenched his fists. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't just a warning shot. The Xilari had made their decision. They saw humanity as weak, unworthy, insignificant, and they had no intention of letting them leave. "We have to abandon ship," Patel shouted. Carter hesitated. Leaving the Pioneer felt like failure, but the lives of his crew mattered more than pride. "Everyone to the escape pods. Now." The crew rushed to comply. Emergency sirens blared as hatches opened, revealing the small pods that would carry them away. One by one, the escape pods launched, streaking away from the burning wreckage of the Pioneer. Carter was the last to leave. He stood on the bridge for a moment, watching as the ship, the pride of humanity, broke apart in the cold void of space. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped into the last escape pod and sealed the door. As the pod ejected, Carter looked back. The Pioneer exploded in a burst of fire and debris, pieces of it scattering across the stars. The auxiliary didn't even stay to watch. They had already left, as if humanity wasn't even worth confirming as destroyed. But as Captain Carter drifted toward the distant, barren moon where the other escape pods had landed, a fire burned inside him. They had underestimated humanity. They had made a mistake. And one day, humanity would prove it. Captain Elias Carter's escape pod landed with a heavy thud on the barren moon's rocky surface. The impact jolted him in his seat, but he barely noticed. His mind was still replaying the destruction of the U.S. Pioneer. The auxiliary had wiped away humanity's first deep spaceship as if it were nothing. They hadn't even bothered to chase the survivors. That thought angered him more than anything. He unstrapped himself and pushed open the pod's hatch. A vast, gray wasteland stretched before him. Jagged rocks and craters dotted the landscape, and the sky above was pitch black, speckled with distant stars. It was lifeless, desolate, but at least it had an atmosphere. In the distance, he spotted other escape pods. A small feeling of relief washed over him. His crew had made it. Carter activated his suit's communicator. All surviving crew, check in. One by one, voices came through. Patel, Monroe, Valeria Kwan, the Pioneer's chief engineer, along with several others. They were shaken but alive. Everyone, gather at the nearest landing site. Carter instructed. We need to take stock of what we have. It took several hours, but soon, the surviving crew had regrouped. There were 32 of them in total, less than half of the original crew. Some had been lost when the Pioneer exploded. Others hadn't made it to the pods in time. Carter looked around at his people. Their uniforms were torn, their faces weary, but in their eyes, he saw something powerful. They were not broken. We're stranded, Patel said grimly. The emergency beacons in the pods are active, but if the auxiliary control this sector, they might block any signals from reaching human space. We can't rely on rescue, Carter agreed. We have to survive on our own. Kwan crossed her arms, glancing at the wreckage scattered around them. We don't have much, but we do have pieces of the Pioneer. We could use them to build shelter, maybe even some tools. Carter nodded. Then that's our first step. We set up a base, take inventory, and figure out our next move. Building from nothing. The crew worked tirelessly over the next few days. They used broken panels from the escape pods and pieces of the Pioneer's wreckage to construct makeshift shelters. The moon's thin atmosphere provided just enough oxygen to breathe, but they still needed filtration masks for safety. Kwan led a small team to scavenge supplies. There's a lot of tech we can repurpose, she reported. Some power cells are still functional, and I think I can modify them to keep our systems running. Carter knew Kwan was a genius. If anyone could make something out of nothing, it was her. Do what you can, he said. Meanwhile, Patel and Monroe worked on communication. They boosted the escape pod's distress signals, hoping someone in human space would pick them up. But days passed with no response. One evening, as Carter walked through the camp, he found Kwan hunched over a piece of salvage technology, her face deep in concentration. What are you working on? He asked. Kwan didn't look up. An idea, she muttered. The auxiliary think we're weak. They destroyed our ship like it was nothing. But what if we build something better? Carter raised an eyebrow. We barely have a working camp, and you're thinking about a ship. She finally looked at him, her eyes blazing with determination. Not just any ship, Captain. The best ship. A ship that can stand up to the auxiliary. Carter was silent for a moment. The idea seemed impossible. They had limited resources, no proper construction facilities, and only a handful of engineers. And yet, the auxiliary had dismissed them as insignificant. If humanity wanted to survive in this galaxy, they needed to prove otherwise. How would we even begin? He asked. Kwan grinned. We start small. We gather everything we can from the wreckage. We reverse engineer whatever auxiliary tech we find, and we build. Carter looked around at his people. They were engineers, scientists, pilots. They were survivors. And now, they would become something more. He turned back to Quan and nodded. Then let's get to work. A new mission. The days turned into weeks. The survivors worked with relentless energy, scavenging every usable part they could find. Quan's team carefully studied auxiliary components, deciphering their advanced technology piece by piece. Every setback only made them more determined. Every failure became a lesson. Paddle developed new communication systems, allowing them to stay in contact across the moon. Monroe helped design defensive barriers, just in case the auxiliary returned. Carter oversaw the entire operation, ensuring that morale stayed high. It was slow progress, but every day their vision became clearer. They weren't just trying to survive anymore. They were building something greater. They were building the Revenant, a ship that would one day change everything. The cold wind swept across the barren moon, carrying fine dust over the makeshift human settlement. What had once been a scattered collection of escape pods was now a growing base. It wasn't much. Metal shelters built from wreckage, repurposed energy cells providing power, and a small food supply from emergency rations. But it was home. And more importantly, it was a workshop. Captain Elias Carter walked through the camp, watching his people work. Despite everything they had lost, they refused to give up. Engineers, scientists, and technicians moved between workstations, welding metal, testing circuits, and piecing together machinery. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building the Revenant, reverse engineering the enemy. Chief Engineer Valeria Quan wiped sweat from her forehead as she examined a glowing blue power core, one of the few intact pieces of auxiliary technology they had salvaged. Around her, a team of engineers worked tirelessly, dismantling alien components and connecting them to human systems. "This thing is incredible," Quan muttered, tracing her fingers along the smooth metallic surface of the core. "It's way beyond anything we have, but I think we can use it." Carter crossed his arms. "How?" Quan's eyes sparkled with excitement. "The auxiliary use energy differently than us. Their ships don't run on fuel like ours. Their reactors pull energy directly from subspace, making them faster, more efficient." She tapped the core. "If we can figure out how to stabilize this technology, we won't just match their power. We'll surpass it." Carter nodded. "Do whatever it takes." Quan grinned. "Oh, I will." Training the future crew. While the engineers worked on the Revenant, Lieutenant Sarah Padel focused on another challenge: training. If they built the most advanced ship in the galaxy, they needed a crew that could handle it. She stood in front of a group of survivors, their uniforms torn, their faces hardened by struggle. These weren't soldiers. They were pilots, technicians, and scientists. But they had something greater than experience: determination. "We don't have simulators, and we don't have textbooks," Paddle said. "But we do have minds that adapt. The auxiliary think we're weak because we don't have their technology. They're wrong. Our strength is that we learn." She turned to a broken piece of auxiliary control systems. "We'll study everything. How they navigate, how they fight, how they think. And when the time comes, we'll show them exactly what humans are capable of." The crew nodded in silent agreement. They didn't need weapons to fight back. They only needed time. Building the impossible, days turned into weeks. The Revenant took shape. It wasn't built in a factory, nor was it constructed with perfect precision. It was welded together from the remains of the Pioneer and alien wreckage. Every piece of metal was reshaped by human hands. Every wire was connected with effort and care. Carter stood before the massive hull of the ship. It was rough, uneven, and unfinished, but it was beautiful. Monroe approached, wiping grease from his hands. "She won't be pretty, Captain, but she'll be strong." "That's all we need," Carter replied. Quan ran up, holding a tablet. "We have a problem." Carter sighed. Of course we do. What is it? The power core is stable, but we need a way to shield it. If it overloads, it could take the whole ship with it. Carter frowned. Can we fix it? Quan hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but we need more materials. Carter looked out at the barren landscape. Then we find them. The first test. The Revenant wasn't finished, but it was time to see if she could fly. The crew gathered around as Quan and her team activated the reactor. A deep hum filled the air. The ship's core glowed, its energy stabilizing. The hull vibrated, as if the Revenant itself was waking up. Then, with a low, steady roar, the ship lifted off the ground. Cheers erupted from the crew. After months of struggle, after being left for dead, they had done the impossible. They had built a ship. Carter placed a hand on the hull, feeling the steady pulse of power beneath his fingertips. This wasn't just a machine. This was humanity's answer. This was the beginning of something greater. The barren moon remained silent, its gray dust stretching endlessly under a dark sky filled with distant stars. But within the small human settlement, something extraordinary was happening. The survivors of the U.S. Pioneer were not just surviving. They were building. Captain Elias Carter stood on a rocky ridge, looking down at the growing base. It was rough, made of scrap metal and salvage technology, but it was proof of one thing. Humanity never gives up. For weeks, they had worked tirelessly, breaking apart the wreckage of their ship, reverse engineering whatever auxiliary technology they could salvage, and slowly shaping their greatest creation, the Revenant, a ship unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. The challenge of alien technology. Chief Engineer Valeria Quan wiped her hands on her torn uniform, her face smeared with grease. In front of her, a team of engineers worked on a glowing blue energy core, salvaged from the wreckage of a destroyed auxiliary ship. Carter approached. How's it going? Quan let out a frustrated sigh. Their tech is advanced, Captain. This energy core is way more powerful than anything humans have ever built. If we can figure out how it works, the Revenant won't just fly. It'll outmatch any auxiliary ship. Carter crossed his arms. So what's the problem? Quan tapped the metal casing. The auxiliary designed this for their own systems. It's not compatible with human technology. If we don't find a way to integrate it, it'll either overload or do nothing at all. Carter glanced at the engineers around them, exhausted but determined. They had come too far to stop now. Then we make it compatible, he said firmly. Quan grinned. That's what I wanted to hear. Preparing the crew. While Quan and the engineers worked on the ship, Lieutenant Sarah Patil was leading another critical operation, training the crew. In an open space near the settlement, she stood before a group of survivors. They weren't soldiers. They were engineers, technicians, and scientists. But now, they had to become something more. She picked up a salvaged auxiliary control panel and held it up. The auxiliary believe they're superior because they were born with this technology, she said. But humans? We learn. We adapt. She placed the panel on the ground. Over the next few weeks, we're going to learn everything about their systems. We're going to think like them. And when the time comes, we'll use their own knowledge against them. A murmur of agreement spread through the group. They were tired, but in their eyes, Patil saw determination. Monroe, the ship's former weapons officer, stepped forward. And what about combat? If the auxiliary come back, we won't stand a chance. Patil smirked. That's where we get creative. A new kind of ship. The Revenant was unlike any human ship before. Instead of traditional engines, it used salvaged auxiliary subspace drives. Instead of standard shields, it had an experimental energy barrier. Instead of relying on brute force, it was built for speed, strategy, and adaptability. Day by day, the skeleton of the ship took shape. Welders sparked in the darkness, wires were connected, systems were tested. The work was slow, but it was progress. One night, as Carter inspected the half-built hull, Quan walked up beside him. "We're getting close," she said. "But there's one last problem." Carter sighed. "Of course there is." Quan chuckled. "The power core. We figured out how to integrate it, but we need a stabilizer. Otherwise, when we activate it, the ship could, well, explode." Carter nodded. "Then we find a stabilizer." Quan's expression turned serious. "The only problem is, we don't have the right materials. If we had access to auxiliary supply depot, we could get what we need." Carter's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting we steal from the auxiliary?" Quan grinned. "They already think we're dead. They won't see it coming." Carter thought for a moment. It was a risk, but wasn't everything they were doing a risk? If they wanted to survive, they had to be bold. He turned to Patel and Monroe, who had just arrived. "We're putting together a mission," he said. "We're going to steal the parts we need from the auxiliary." Patel raised an eyebrow. "Are you serious?" Carter nodded. "We didn't come this far just to stop now. It's time to show the auxiliary exactly what humanity is made of." The cold winds of the barren moon howled through the human settlement as Captain Elias Carter and his team prepared for their most dangerous mission yet. The Revenant was nearly complete, but without a power stabilizer, the ship wouldn't fly. And the only way to get one: steal it from the auxiliary. The idea was bold, maybe even reckless, but there was no other choice. The auxiliary had left them for dead. They wouldn't expect a handful of stranded humans to strike back. Carter stood inside the main shelter, a crude metal structure built from the wreckage of the Pioneer. A holographic map flickered on the table before him, displaying a nearby auxiliary supply depot. "This is our target," he said, looking at his team. "We go in fast, get what we need, and get out before they know what's happening." Lieutenant Sarah Patel crossed her arms. "We're not soldiers, Captain. How do we pull this off?" Monroe, the former weapons officer, grinned. "We don't need to fight them head-on. We just need to be smarter." Carter nodded. "Exactly. We use stealth. The auxiliary won't expect us, and that's our advantage." Quan, the chief engineer, tapped on the map. "Their security is automated. If we can disable their systems, we'll have just enough time to grab the stabilizer and escape." Patel exhaled. "All right, let's do it." Into the enemy's territory. The small strike team, Carter, Patel, Monroe, Quan, and 2 engineers, traveled through the moon's rocky terrain, keeping low to avoid auxiliary patrols. The supply depot was a sleek, metallic structure, its glowing blue lights standing out against the dark sky. Carter peered through a pair of binoculars. "There," he whispered. "Main entrance is guarded. But look, ventilation shafts along the side." Quan smirked. "Good thing humans are smaller than auxiliary." Moving silently, they approached the depot. Monroe took out a small device, hacking into the security grid. "We're in," he whispered. "Cameras are looping fake footage. They won't see us coming." One by one, they slipped into the vents, crawling through the tight space until they reached the main storage area. The room was filled with advanced auxiliary technology, energy cores, weapon parts, and navigation modules. But they only needed one thing. "There," Quan whispered, pointing to a glowing cylinder mounted on the wall. "The power stabilizer." Patel moved quickly, detaching it while Carter kept watch. Just as they were about to leave, a deep, humming sound echoed through the depot. The security system was coming back online. "Time to go," Carter whispered urgently. They rushed back to the vent, but before they could climb inside, an auxiliary drone floated into the room. Its glowing red eye scanned the area. Monroe didn't hesitate. He grabbed a nearby metal rod and hurled it at the drone. Sparks flew as the machine crashed to the ground. "Now we really have to go," Patel said. The Great Escape. The team ran through the depot, alarms blaring behind them. The auxiliary would arrive soon. They had to move fast. As they reached the exit, a patrol ship descended from the sky, blocking their path. "We're trapped," Quan shouted. Carter's mind raced. There was no time to think, only time to act. "Split up," he ordered. "Meet back at the settlement." The team scattered, dodging energy blasts as the auxiliary opened fire. Monroe and Paddle sprinted toward a rocky ridge, using the uneven terrain as cover. Quan ran in the opposite direction, the stabilizer clutched tightly in her hands. Carter drew his blaster, one of the few weapons they had salvaged, and fired at the auxiliary troops. He wasn't trying to hit them, just distract them long enough for his team to escape. As the auxiliary focused on him, Patel and Monroe reached a hidden escape tunnel they had scouted earlier. Quan wasn't far behind. Carter fired one last shot, then sprinted after them, disappearing into the shadows just as the auxiliary energy blast exploded behind him. Victory in the shadows. Hours later, back at the human settlement, the team gathered around the stabilizer. Quan inspected it carefully, then nodded. "It's perfect. This will keep the Revenant's power core stable. We did it." Carter looked at his exhausted but victorious team. They had done the impossible, stolen from the auxiliary, and lived to tell the tale. "This is just the beginning," he said. "The auxiliary think we're weak. They think we're finished." He turned toward the half-built Revenant, its dark hull reflecting the distant starlight. "They have no idea what's coming." The human settlement was alive with energy. For the first time in months, hope burned bright in every survivor's heart. The mission to steal the power stabilizer had been a success, and now the Revenant, humanity's greatest creation, was nearly complete. Captain Elias Carter stood before the massive hull of the ship, running his fingers along the cold metal. This ship was built from the wreckage of the Pioneer and salvaged auxiliary technology. It was a symbol of human resilience, of their refusal to surrender. Beside him, Chief Engineer Valeria Quan wiped sweat from her brow. "The stabilizer is installed," she said. "This ship is officially operational." Carter exhaled. "Then it's time for the first test." The first flight. Inside the ship, the control room was a mix of human and alien technology. The control panels glowed with an eerie blue light, the auxiliary interface now modified for human use. Screens flickered to life, showing system diagnostics. Quan tapped a few keys. "Power core is stable. Engines are at full capacity." Lieutenant Sarah Patel took her seat at the navigation console. "Engines ready. Just say the word, Captain." Carter looked around at his crew. Monroe was at the weapons station, Patel at navigation, Quan monitoring the systems. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were pioneers. Carter took a deep breath. "All right, let's take her up." The ship rumbled as the engines roared to life. Dust swirled around the settlement as the Revenant lifted off the ground. It wasn't just flying, it was soaring. A cheer erupted from the people below. "We did it," Patel whispered. But the celebration was short-lived. The auxiliary returned. The warning light flashed. Monroe's face turned grim. "We've got incoming." On the screen, 3 auxiliary warships were approaching fast. They had finally noticed the human settlement. Carter clenched his jaw. "They think we're still stranded. They have no idea what's waiting for them." Patel's fingers moved across the controls. "They'll be in attack range in 2 minutes." Quan frowned. "We're not ready for battle. We just got this ship in the air." Carter looked at Monroe. "Weapons online." Monroe shook his head. "Not yet. We still need time." Time. It was the one thing they didn't have. Carter's mind raced. If they fought now, they would lose. But if they ran, the auxiliary would destroy the settlement. "We need to draw them away," he said. "Make them chase us." Patel nodded, setting course away from the base. The Revenant turned sharply, rocketing away from the moon's surface. The auxiliary ships followed instantly. The chase begins. The stars blurred as the Revenant sped through space. The auxiliary ships closed in, their energy weapons charging. "We need to go faster," Monroe shouted. Quan slammed her fist on the console. "I told you, We're pushing the engines to the limit. Carter gritted his teeth. The Revenant was fast, but the Xelari had superior technology. They would catch up soon. A sudden energy blast rocked the ship. Sparks flew from the ceiling. Shields are holding, but not for long. Patel yelled. Carter took a deep breath. They weren't ready for a fight, but they could outthink their enemy. Take us into that asteroid field, he ordered, pointing to a dense cluster of rocks ahead. Monroe's eyes widened. That's crazy. Carter smirked. Good. They won't expect it. Through the asteroids. The Revenant dived into the asteroid field, weaving through massive rocks with incredible speed. Patel's hands moved quickly over the controls, avoiding each collision by inches. The auxiliary ships followed, but they weren't as agile. One of the enemy ships crashed into an asteroid, exploding in a bright flash. Monroe laughed. One down. The remaining two auxiliary ships adjusted their course, firing wildly at the Revenant. Energy blasts tore through asteroids, sending debris flying. Shields at 30%. Quan shouted. Carter's mind worked fast. They needed one last trick to escape. Then he saw it. A giant asteroid, larger than all the rest. Patel, take us behind that asteroid and power down everything. She hesitated for only a second before obeying. The Revenant disappeared behind the massive rock, going completely dark. Seconds later, the two auxiliary ships rushed past, scanning the area. They circled the asteroid for a moment. Then, believing the humans were gone, they turned and flew away. Monroe let out a breath. They fell for it. Carter allowed himself a small smile. We live to fight another day. A new beginning. The Revenant returned to the human settlement, landing softly on the moon's surface. The people cheered as their heroes stepped out of the ship. Carter looked at his crew. We built something incredible today, but this is just the beginning. Quan nodded. Next time, we won't run. We'll be ready. Monroe grinned, and we'll show the Xelari exactly what humanity can do. Carter turned to the sky, where the Xelari had disappeared. They thought humans were weak. They were wrong. The Revenant stood tall in the human settlement, its dark hull reflecting the dim light of the nearby star. It was no longer just a ship. It was a symbol of defiance. Humanity was no longer running. They had a weapon, and now it was time to use it. Captain Elias Carter stood before his crew, his eyes scanning the determined faces around him. The Xelari thought the humans were weak. They thought they had won. But they had made a mistake. They had left survivors. Carter turned to Lieutenant Sarah Patel, Monroe, and Chief Engineer Valeria Quan. We've tested the ship. We've outmaneuvered the Xelari. But that was just survival. Now, we strike back. Monroe grinned. Finally, I was getting tired of running. Patel nodded. What's the plan, Captain? Carter activated the holographic map, showing a Xelari fuel station orbiting a nearby gas giant. This is our target. It's lightly guarded, but it supplies their entire fleet in this sector. Quan's eyes widened. If we destroy it, they'll be crippled. Carter nodded. Exactly. We take out their supply chain, and they won't have the fuel to chase us. We get in, strike hard, and get out before reinforcements arrive. Monroe cracked his knuckles. Let's give them a reason to fear us. The journey to battle. The Revenant lifted off, its engines humming with power. Unlike their last mission, there was no hesitation this time. They weren't running. They were hunting. Inside the cockpit, Patel monitored the scanners. We're approaching the fuel station. 2 guard ships on patrol. Carter leaned forward. Monroe, are our weapons ready? Monroe's fingers danced over the control panel. Laser turrets and missile launchers are primed. Shields are at full power. Quan added, engines are stable. We can move fast if needed. Carter smiled. Then let's begin. The ambush. The Revenant surged forward, its powerful engines propelling it toward the auxiliary fuel station. The enemy didn't react at first. They didn't expect an attack. Then, warning sirens blared across the station. The two auxiliary guard ships turned to engage, their weapons powering up. "Here we go," Monroe shouted. The first auxiliary ship fired a plasma blast, but Paddle quickly maneuvered the Revenant to the side, dodging it. Carter's voice was calm. "Return fire." Monroe grinned and pressed the trigger. The Revenant's laser turrets blazed to life, striking one of the enemy ships directly on its engines. The auxiliary ship exploded in a fiery burst. The second auxiliary ship rushed toward them, trying to circle around. "They're flanking us," Patel warned. Carter didn't hesitate. "Quan, give me full power to the engines." Quan pushed a lever forward. Done. The Revenant shot upward, moving faster than the auxiliary expected. The enemy ship tried to follow, but Monroe was ready. "Missiles away," he shouted. A pair of missiles launched from the Revenant, streaking through space. They slammed into the enemy ship, breaking it apart in an instant. The sky was clear. Only the fuel station remained. Destroying the station, Carter stared at the station ahead. It was a massive structure, filled with glowing fuel tanks and docking ports. If they could destroy it, the auxiliary fleet would be stranded. "Target the fuel tanks," Carter ordered. Monroe locked onto the station. Locked and loaded. "Fire." The Revenant unleashed a barrage of missiles and laser blasts. The weapons tore through the station's structure, hitting the fuel reserves. For a moment, there was silence. Then, boom! A massive explosion erupted from the station, sending debris flying in all directions. A fireball consumed the structure, and shockwaves rippled through space. Quan shielded her eyes from the bright light. "That's one less supply station for the auxiliary." Carter nodded, but he knew this wasn't over. "Paddle, scan for reinforcements." She checked the radar, and her expression changed. "Captain, we have a problem." The auxiliary fleet arrives. On the screen, multiple auxiliary warships appeared, dropping out of hyperspace. Carter clenched his jaw. They responded faster than I thought. Quan's hands flew over the controls. "If they catch us, we're done." Monroe checked the weapon systems. "We can't fight an entire fleet." Carter exhaled. They had done what they came for. Now, they had to escape. "Patel, get us out of here. Now." The Revenant turned sharply, its engines roaring as it blasted away at top speed. Behind them, the auxiliary fleet opened fire, chasing them through space. "Shields holding," Quan reported, "but not for long." Carter made a quick decision. Jumped to hyperspace. Patel punched in the coordinates. The Revenant's engines glowed bright, energy building up. And then, Duom, the ship vanished into hyperspace, leaving the auxiliary fleet behind. Victory and warning. Minutes later, the Revenant re-emerged near a distant asteroid field. Everyone exhaled. "That was too close," Monroe said, wiping sweat from his brow. Carter looked at his crew. "But we did it. The auxiliary fleet is crippled. They won't be able to operate in this sector for a long time." Patel's face was serious. "But now, they'll be looking for us." Quan nodded. "They won't ignore us anymore." Carter stared at the stars. The auxiliary had always underestimated humanity. But now, for the first time, they would see the truth. The humans weren't just survivors. They were warriors. And the war had only just begun. The Revenant floated in the darkness of space, hidden within a dense asteroid field. Inside, Captain Elias Carter stood before his crew, his face calm but determined. They had struck the auxiliary hard, destroying their fuel station and crippling their fleet. But now, the enemy was coming for revenge. Patel turned from the radar console. "Captain, the auxiliary fleet is on the move. They're scanning every system. It won't be long before they find us." Monroe clenched his fists. "We should hit them first, catch them off guard." Carter nodded. That's exactly what we're going to do. The crew exchanged glances. They had spent months running, hiding, and surviving. Now they had a chance to end this fight on their own terms. Quan folded her arms. What's the plan, Captain? Carter pulled up a holographic map of the nearby system. A red marker highlighted the Xilari command ship, the heart of their operations in this sector. We take out their flagship, Carter said. Without their leader, the fleet will fall into chaos. Patel's eyes widened. That's risky. They'll have defenses. Monroe grinned. Good. I like a challenge. Carter smirked. Then let's give them one. The approach. The Revenant moved carefully through the asteroid field, using the massive floating rocks for cover. Patel guided the ship with expert precision, avoiding the Xilari patrols. Finally, they reached the edge of the enemy fleet. The Xilari command ship loomed ahead, surrounded by warships. Quan checked the sensors. That's a lot of firepower. Carter remained focused. We won't fight them head-on. We use speed and surprise. Monroe grinned, his hands ready over the weapon's controls. I've got some special missiles prepared. Let's make some noise. Carter gave the order. Attack. The battle begins. The Revenant exploded out of the asteroid field, its engines roaring. The Xilari were caught off guard. Alarms blared across their fleet as the human ship fired a barrage of missiles and lasers, striking the smaller Xilari vessels. 2 enemy ships exploded instantly. Monroe whooped. That got their attention. The Xilari returned fire, plasma blasts streaking toward the Revenant. Patel swerved the ship, dodging the worst of the attacks, but a blast rocked the hull. Shields at 60%, Quan reported. Carter remained steady. We're not stopping. Get us to the command ship. The Revenant pushed forward, weaving between enemy ships. Monroe fired at anything that moved, while Patel kept them flying at breakneck speed. Then the Xilari flagship turned its massive cannons toward them. Brace for impact, Patel shouted. A massive energy beam fired from the flagship, streaking toward the Revenant. But at the last second, Carter shouted, Dive now. Patel sent the ship into a sharp nosedive, and the Xilari blast missed by inches, hitting one of their own ships instead. Monroe laughed. They just blew up their own guy. Carter grinned. Now let's finish this. The final strike. The Revenant raced toward the Xilari flagship, dodging enemy fire. Monroe locked onto the command ship's bridge, the heart of its operations. Missiles ready. Carter didn't hesitate. Fire everything. Monroe launched every remaining missile, the Revenant's weapons blazing with power. The missiles streaked toward the Xilari flagship, striking its engines, defenses, and finally, the bridge. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, boom! A massive explosion ripped through the flagship, breaking it apart from the inside. Fire and debris filled space as the command ship collapsed into itself and exploded in a brilliant flash. The Xilari fleet froze in shock. Without their leader, they had no direction. One by one, the remaining Xilari ships turned and retreated. Monroe pumped his fist. They're running. Patel exhaled. We actually did it. Carter watched as the enemy fleet fled into the stars. For the first time, the Xilari were afraid. A new era. Back at the human settlement, celebrations erupted as the Revenant landed. Survivors cheered, knowing that the Xilari threat was finally over. Carter stepped onto the ground, looking at his crew. We've proven that humanity won't back down. We fight. We survive. Quan smiled. And we build something stronger. Monroe crossed his arms. What now, Captain? Carter looked up at the stars, a small smile forming. Now, he chuckled, now we explore. The universe just learned what humanity can do. The crew stood together, ready for whatever came next. Humanity had won, and their story was just beginning.